Welcome to the Rising Up post show right here on FoxLA.com. We just ran the premiere of Fox 11's new 5-part docuseries. It's a look at 2020, the death of George Floyd, the protests and the conversations around race, policing, and social justice. Each night we'll be joined by a panel to break down what we just saw and discuss some of the issues, the larger issues. So thank you for being with us. I'm Christine Devine. We do want to bring in our guests here tonight. Tammi Mack, writer, producer, radio personality, and host of the Tammi Mack Late Show on Fox Soul. Welcome, Tammi. We thank you for being with us. And also broadcaster, yeah, you got it. And also broadcaster John Kobylt, co-host of the John and Ken Show on KFI Radio and iHeartRadio, one of the most listened to radio shows in the country. We appreciate you both for being here. John, start me out here. As you looked back in time with us there, how did that feel to look at 2020 from the start?
Well, everything stirs up emotions about 2020. I mean, from beginning to end. I mean, from, Kobe Bryant dying, that was an extreme shock. And then all the pandemic insanity, which was really depressing. It was a depressing time to live in day to day. And then the George Floyd tape is sickening to watch. It's difficult to watch for more than just, a few seconds, really. You watch it because you feel you're obligated to. But as far as your physical reaction to it, it's overwhelming. And then, when you watch the destruction, for me, I sit there and I look at all the destruction that was going on in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and I'm thinking, this isn't going to help at all. This is going to make things worse. And this is making victims of a lot of innocent people who obviously had nothing to do with George Floyd's death, nor any other problem with the police or any other race issues. They're just trying to live their lives, run their business. For example, in the Fairfax district, and the police chief and the mayor allowed 88 of those businesses to be burned, destroyed, looted. And, watching that made me angry and sorrowful for those people all over again. So, there were a lot of emotions, and there were a lot of victims after the George Floyd killing, which, I still have not run into a single person who thought that there was anything justified about what Derek Chauvin did. Nobody. I think the whole world agrees on that. But then you get into all the collateral damage from these protests, a lot of people feeling that they're doing something noble. Well, there were a lot of people who suffered from all these protests, and those people really don't get much attention to this day.
Well, John, you took us through a whole range of emotions there. I just saw the documentary myself to preview it yesterday, and it was like a punch in the gut there, thinking of all we went through in 2020. Tammi, let's go to you now. As you watched it, your thoughts?
Well, listen, 2020 was a year that I don't think anyone who was born before the 60s could have ever imagined happening in America. I mean, it was emotionally draining. It was physically draining. It was mentally draining. And yes, of course, we kicked it off with Kobe Bryant, which really, when you think about Kobe Bryant and his name being synonymous with the Lakers, synonymous with LA, but when he died, I think we realized in LA that he didn't just mean so much to us. He meant so much on a global level. There were people having tributes for Kobe Bryant in Tokyo, in Italy. I mean, this was a loss, a global loss. And then we moved from a global loss to a global pandemic. And then we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and we get this one instance that happens where a police officer murders a man in cold blood on a platform that goes global. And all of a sudden that sparks global protest. I mean, this was one heck of a year when we talk about 2020 and how it's going to be written in history.
So Tammi, give me in about 30 seconds, if you could. Was there a moment or person in the series, this is just part one, that stood out to you?
Is there a moment or a person? I believe the moment is everyone's moment. It's the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck. That is what will forever be ingrained in everyone's head throughout their lifetime, I believe.
All right, John, I'll ask you the same question. We're trying to hit a certain break here to welcome our viewers who've been watching this on Fox 11 on TV. So my question for you is, as you watch that documentary, was there a moment or a person that really stood out to you?
Oh, I think it's the same moment. But what struck me was Chauvin, his coldness. He's a psychopath. And with psychopaths, they have no conscience. They have no remorse. They don't feel pain. They don't feel any empathy. And him just squatting there on George Floyd's neck was so, like it was a strange kind of violence. It was obviously violence, but it wasn't like a fight or a shootout or a stabbing or something. It was just this slow squeezing the life out of a person, which I don't think any of us had ever seen before, which is what made it so shocking. It was the weirdness of what he was doing and that he had no emotion, no reaction from it. And you realized it didn't matter to him. He didn't care. At no point did he think, I've gone too far.
Well, my first seeing of that video itself was actually for the job. We had one of our sister stations get an interview with George Floyd's relatives, so I had to watch the video itself to then put together the story with the relatives. And I remember, as I said in the series today, I couldn't even watch the whole video. I had seen enough. We do want to bring in our viewers who are watching it on TV versus digital. We have no commercials on digital, so we got to jumpstart this here. It's now after 6:30, so thank you for joining us if you were watching Rising Up on Fox 11. Tonight's episode, as you saw, looked back at a tumultuous 2020, the first time we heard the name George Floyd, and the protests that began to emerge with the news of his death. Let's take a look, though, at a clip of part one.
The pandemic and the shutdowns and the uncertainty about that, not knowing how bad that's going to be.
And in the middle of this once-in-a-century pandemic, this video pops up.
What do you want?
I can breathe. This man is literally dying under his knee.
So I started seeing it pop up. So I was like, who is George Floyd and what's going on?
I saw it on social media first because I'm not a fan of watching the repetitive videotapes because it triggers something in my anxiety and trauma, you know, things of that nature. So I seen different people talk about it on social media, so I would scroll by really fast.
But something shifted with George Floyd. Something shifted because we were essentially in solitary confinement when he was killed. We were forced to look at what happened. We were forced to reconcile. We were all there. It's not like you were too busy or you were off on a ski trip in Aspen or you were, you know, at summer school or whatever. Everybody was aware of what had gone on the world over.
And so people marched. We wound up marching kind of around downtown. There was a freeway shut down.
We had Skyfox over it, and we saw all the protesters swarming onto the freeway, and a couple of CHP cruisers came by to try to disperse the crowd. The crowd swarmed the CHP cruisers, threw a skateboard in the back of the window, busted it out.
Devine of Fox 11 News, thank you for being with us. Our discussion panelists tonight are Tammi Mack, host of the Tammi Mack Late Show on Fox Soul, and John Kobylt, co-host of the John and Ken Show on KFI and iHeartRadio. So let me bring you back into the conversation here. Tomorrow is the one-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. Tammi, why do you think this discussion is an important one to still have today?
Well, I want to make it clear that it wasn't George Floyd that sparked the Black community's mistrust with the police. And I think so many people think that that's where it started. What George Floyd did was justify the Black community's mistrust with the police. And finally, I believe our reality was heard around the world, that this is not the first time and it will not be the last time. And there were three instances before that had happened, but it didn't take on the level of George Floyd because no one watched those people die, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. But then George Floyd, we watched die. And then after George Floyd, there were more. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to continue talking about what happened with Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd. Absolutely a situation that should never not be discussed.
You both are radio hosts. John, talk to me about why it's still important to have this conversation.
Well, it's important to see what the long-term reaction to this is, because the short-term reaction, again, is not helpful. There's a lot of shouts to defund the police, but really no large numbers of people really want that. There's a fringe that's very loud about it, but you look at the polling and it's 2 to 1, 3 to 1. People want the same amount of police or more spending on police. I don't think it's helpful to pull back the police in a lot of neighborhoods, because in LA, first 4 months of the year, shootings went up by 73%. The budget was cut some. The police obviously been told to stand down to some extent. So that's not helpful. You know, a lot of the shootings are in minority communities. I don't see how that does any good to have less police. What we're talking about is maybe an internal system for the bad police to be removed well ahead of a tragedy. Derek Chauvin had a long record of misbehavior, and he was never disciplined to any great extent. He still had his job, obviously, but when you looked at his record, there was no surprise that if anybody was going to do something like this, it would be him. And that's a very specific problem, the disciplinary structure inside a police department, which most of the public is not privy to. But to have this wholesale bumper sticker cliche, defund the police, is absolutely absurd.
You kind of got to perhaps one of my last questions I had on my list, which was, what more do you want to talk about? Remember, we're letting our viewers know that this is a series that's going to run 5 nights. It runs every night here at 6 o'clock. So I think, John, you're kind of tackling the issue we're talking about more on Wednesday or Thursday. So let me stick with today right now. And about that video, that George Floyd video, remember, we started this series with the death of Kobe Bryant. Then we hit the pandemic. Talk about, Tammi, I'll start you here, on how quickly that George Floyd video caught on and why you think that is.
I think it's no secret that the video caught on because we were all in our homes on lockdown, not able to go to the movies, not able to go to school, not able to go to church. And I think it was almost like we were racehorses. We were in our stable waiting, you know, for the gun to go off. And then George Floyd happens and it's like, bang! The gun goes off and we are off to the races. It's protest time now. And finally, I mean, because there were people on one side of the coin saying, well, is there not a pandemic anymore? Because people are protesting and they're not wearing masks. How can we protest, but we can't go to church? How can we protest, but we can't go to the movies? But I think that people for once came together. I mean, even John said, look, it was wrong what happened to this man. It was wrong. And I don't think anybody disagrees with how wrong it was. And I think the pandemic fueled something in people that had already kind of been marinating in terms of not being able to let loose or do anything. And so finally, we have an opportunity to do something that's productive, to do something for mankind, and to do something for the American justice system so that it will be equal in some sort of way. And this is what happened. We all decided to go out during a pandemic and protest for equal rights.
John, where were you when you heard about the video, saw the video, and how'd you deal with it on your radio show?
You know, my memory of it is it's slowly creeping into consciousness, where you heard there was a bad video, you saw quick images of it on screen. I don't remember the whole video being out for a few days. I might be wrong. I remember waiting to see what the significance would be for Los Angeles. Because often there are shootings that happen 1,000 or 3,000 miles away, and sometimes they become something that touches everything, and sometimes it's just a local story. So I just remember there was, I guess, at least a few days of, I kind of have a 3-day rule on a lot of stories. I wait for 3 days to see if the original story is accurate. to see if all the facts are out, or do they change, especially in the last few years.
So what was the moment you knew it was going to be different?
I think when we saw the length of the video, when I finally got to see how long it went on, I think wasn't just shootings happen obviously really fast, right? In a matter of seconds, maybe there's 30 seconds of video. Even a beating is just maybe a couple minutes. But this was just him sitting there, squeezing the life out of George Floyd, and it was just. And I thought it took a few days before things really blew. I think people absorbed it over time. It wasn't an immediate eruption.
Well,
was the way I remember it.
Yeah, I was working from home due to the pandemic, and then when the protests hit, it was important that I come into work to deal with the immediacy of things that were happening and to connect with the technical things that you need to do to cover news. Tammi, you talked about other cases making the news. What was different about this one and the way it took off?
What was different is that it was filmed. But I also want to say that I know John said that it was something that no one ever thought that they would see, something to that effect. And I believe that wholeheartedly. I think Black America, however, was not surprised by what happened that day. And I think that's what the world, and particularly America, needs to know. Black America is used to this. We're accustomed to this behavior from the police. We're accustomed to not being treated fair. Like, this is not new. We've watched police kill our brothers and our sons and our uncles right in front of our eyes. So this is not the first time it has been in front of Black America's eyes. It's the first time that it's ever been in front of everyone else in America's eyes. And that's what changed and made it different.
Tammi, what do you say about the protesters? And then we saw the looting, and we really focus on that a lot tomorrow. We take you to the Melrose Fairfax district as well. We saw looting in Santa Monica and Long Beach. What do you make of the difference there?
Well, I am saddened by all the businesses that lost out in this. It's horrific. And no one in their right mind thinks that it's okay to loot, to steal, to burn, or to destroy businesses that have been built from the ground up by families and these individual people. This is America, where you come to make it, where opportunity is. This is the greatest country in the world. So no one wants anyone's businesses to be destroyed. However, Martin Luther King said, riot is the language of the unheard. And I have to say, it was those protests that now allowed Black businesses to surge. It also allowed for a conversation about police reform. It also allowed for a conversation about reparations. Now, whether these things happen or not, the conversation is open. And the conversation is open because these riots allowed people to be heard. It's unfortunate. I wish that America would hear before the riots began, but I don't think the riots is where we start. When we start talking about who's right and who's wrong, I think we should go a little further than that and think about how America has treated a certain portion of this country unfair. That's where we should start, and that's where our anger should be.
So as we think of what we witnessed a year ago this week, as we think of the conversations we've been having with our friends and our family and our colleagues, we're going to be covering this for a full week, every night at 6 o'clock for a full half hour. John and Tammi, you have the pro and con of you guys being on the first episode, as you've only seen the first episode. John, I'll start with you. What more do you want to hear in this series? What more do you expect to see?
I'm looking to the future. And as I said before, I'm looking for the details of exactly what do people want changed. I don't ever buy into the collective guilt of America that all us individuals outside of the police department are responsible for what the police do to Black citizens or anybody else. I don't have any control of the police department. We have an entire city that's out of control in a lot of ways, and nobody in power is listening to anyone on any of these issues. I mean, this city is in a disaster zone, including when it comes to crime, including when it comes to racial situations and the police. So this is part of a long list of things that have just gotten completely out of hand, and nobody is listening to the people at all. Nobody. Not in government, not the mayor, the city council, the governor, the police chief, none of them. Everybody has a lot of platitudes and a lot of cliches and just really a lot of gas. But actual concrete, here's what we're going to do, and this is why it'll make life better, get almost none of that, zero.
So as a radio host, I think you're going to be in business for a long time. All right, Tammi Mack, we've got 5 more days of coverage here on this week in history here in LA. What more do you want to see in our series or hope to see?
I think I would like to see resolution. I would like to see, you know, what strikes me more is I hear John saying that we aren't responsible for individual police, but I believe America as a whole is responsible for the system of our police department. And the system of our police department does not allow for police to be held accountable. And so I would like to hear more about what some of our government officials, who John so poignantly said, aren't really doing that much in the way of helping us and aren't really coming to resolutions. So I would like to hear from our government officials and how, I want to know how they are going to resolve police accountability and responsibility and what they're going to do with police immunity and how they are going to change and develop the relationship between these communities and the police. I think that's been an issue in Los Angeles for decades, and we have to find a way to solve that. And I think accountability starts there. So if we can get some answers there from the uprising, that would be beautiful.
All right, radio hosts Tammi Mack and John Kobylt, we thank you so much for starting us out here. This wraps up tonight's discussion. We thank you both for your perspective. Tomorrow night, you can catch episode 2 of Rising Up on Fox 11 at 6 p.m. We go in depth into the peaceful protests, the violent looting. We hear from a protester who even tried to defend stores. Then join us right back here to break things down. We'll be speaking with Fox 11's own reporter Christina Gonzalez and Phil Schuman about their experience there on the streets. And from an LA County deputy who was on the streets during those protests. So we thank you so much for being with us. I'm Christine Devine.